But my question was, I read Shankara, and in this first chapter, he's saying how lucky it is to be born as human form, in even more so as a male. And then I also know lots of the sages that you talk about are males. So my question is there the feminine part? Is there a different approach, or is there something? I know it doesn't matter because we are not the body, but still, that was my question.
So that's a verse in the right at the beginning of Viveka Chudamani. I often forget about that verse. I try to forget about it maybe. Because Viveka Chudamani is such a wonderful text. It's got so many wonderful teachings. But right at the beginning, there's this rather sexist, chauvinist verse. And I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but I know many kind of modern Sanskrit scholars retranslate that verse. But the verse basically says, don't forget the purpose of the teachings is not to be, the teachings are not actually sexist in their pure form. There are cultural and traditional chauvinist, sexist aspects of the culture, unfortunately. That's just been there over time, unfortunately. That's seeped in. So I don't know enough about the actual text or the Sanskrit or the literature to know exactly what that means. But I can tell you the point of the teachings is to encourage you to do your practice. So the thrust of these verses are, it's people are reborn into different lives. And you're very lucky that you have this human life. That's the point. And you're even luckier that so many people are born into a human life as a human, but they never hear the teachings. And you have heard the teachings. And so many people, and so few people are lucky enough to be born as a human being and have heard the teachings and to come across a teacher. And you have got these things. So don't waste this opportunity. And then the next few verses say, if you don't implement the teachings and do the practice, you're basically a fool. You've wasted this opportunity. So the whole point of this teaching is to say you have a golden opportunity here now. Seize that opportunity. So it's a call to action. That's the purpose of the teaching. But one of the phrases in the text says that you are lucky to be born as a human being who's heard the teaching and to be born into a male body. And this is obviously, this text was written 1400 years ago in a different age. So I've heard different justifications for why it's there. Personally, I just don't like that verse. That's my personal view. I just don't like that verse. And I think it's probably a sexist verse. That's my view. It's a reflection of the time. I don't think it's a different approach for women and men. But I'm a man, right? But genuinely, I don't think there's a different approach for women and men fundamentally. There will be different approaches for different temperaments. And some men may feel that they're more feminine, and some women might feel they're more masculine and the like. So they might be slightly different. There are different approaches, but I don't think what genitals you have really makes much difference, if we can put it so crudely as that. So in some way, just for this to hear the excuses that have been given for that verse, some people say, look, in that time, only men were allowed to study the teachings because of the way the society was. So you were fortunate to be born into a male body, because what they're trying to say is that because the culture, you're allowed to study the teachings, whereas women weren't allowed to study. Some other people have said it doesn't mean you're lucky enough to be a man. They're saying that's a mistranslation. What they're really saying is you're lucky enough to have this kind of manly or masculine temperament, which doesn't sound very convincing to me as a decent translation. I don't know, but then again, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, so maybe I'm wrong. I think it's just some sort of pathetic excuse to say to sort of excuse what essentially is a sexist teaching, probably. But some people say no, he's not. The teacher is not saying you're lucky to be born a man. They're saying you're lucky to have this kind of mentality where you are manly and seizing the opportunity to grasp the teachings and go forth with the teachings. I mean, but even that is sexist. Even if you're saying that's if you're saying, well, it's not about being a male body. So I don't know. Take from that what you may. It's unfortunate. It's right at the beginning of the text as well, because I think a lot of women and men will read that and it'll put them right off. And I forget that verse is there, to be honest. So good that you raised it. I personally just think it's not a fantastic verse in what otherwise is a wonderful text. In terms of spirituality, there are different approaches, but there's only one way eventually, which is the self-inquiry. It doesn't matter if you're male or female, or you're a cow, or you're a frog, or whatever. It's there's one way. It's to abide as the consciousness that you are. Because with realization, you abide as the consciousness of what you are. Ramana, in one of my favorite verses, which I can't remember, of course, properly, because I don't remember them properly. And one of my favorite verses of Ramana's, he says, essentially, silence is liberation. And the means to liberation is through silence. You see? So the means and the end are actually the same. This is why it's the only way. Because it's like saying the only way you can go through the door is to go through the door. That's why it's the only way. The only way to liberation is through self-inquiry, to abide as a self. Because when you are liberated, you're just abiding as the self. You're abiding as pure consciousness. Other people might see you as a body-mind entity living your life with all your quirks and personality traits. But from your point of view, that's just an appearance. You're abiding as the self, always. You're in silence always. So the only way to abide as a self is to abide as the self. This is why it's the only way. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. So I'm not really into the whole masculine, feminine thing. But, I mean, you can say the masculine and feminine aspects of teachings, which, I don't think that's really got to do with being male or female necessarily. That kind of use of the word masculine and feminine that's describing energies that are within all of us to a greater or lesser extent. All of us have a so-called masculine side and a so-called feminine side. And some people have one aspect of them stronger. But that's not really, there's so much overlap, between the genders in terms of those traits. So it's a simple way for everyone. Ramana's teaching. The other thing to mention, actually, in the Upanishads, which is the teachings in which Vedanta are based on, there are plenty of women who are liberated in these texts. So and it's quite interesting because traditionally the priestly caste or the priestly class, the Brahmins, are the people who traditionally studied the teachings. They're sort of the highest class in society, the Brahmin class. But in the Upanishads, a lot of the people who gain liberation are not Brahmins. They're the warrior classes or the working classes. And same in the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita was given by Krishna to Arjuna, and Arjuna was not a Brahmin either. So he was of this warrior class, he was on the battlefield. So what you get in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita is actually a revolutionary teaching, where they're basically saying women and non-Brahmins can attain liberation. So it's quite subversive actually, in its teaching. It's quite radical and revolutionary by saying this is open to everybody. Of course, then what happened is that the people in power then tried to co-opt the scriptures and say, they basically stopped other people from reading them and said, oh no, it's only for the Brahmins, and this is a political power thing. But in the scriptures itself, women are getting liberation through these same methods, and people from all different classes of society as well. What do you think of that answer, Sylvie?
Yeah,
feel free to disagree with me as well. I'm open to that.
No. I agree. I sort of thought about it that since we are not the body, then it doesn't matter what kind of body we have. But I just was intrigued. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy with the answer. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome indeed. Yeah, there is lots of sort of sexist type language built into these sorts of ways of talking, and I would encourage you just to ignore that aspect of it. A lot of people are very into there's a type of spirituality for women, and we've had enough of the male dominated approach and we need a more feminine style spirituality. And maybe there's merit to what's been said there. I think on some ways there might well be. I don't know. But in terms of what I'm sharing, really, in the context of what I'm sharing, the people who are saying that are too attached to their bodies. So it might be right for them to say it because of where they're at. It might be right for somebody to look for a more feminine style spirituality for them. I wouldn't stop someone if that's what they wanted to do. But probably that person, and I don't know how this comes across, but probably that person isn't ready for self-inquiry fully, in the sense that we have to go beyond these ideas of limitation of body-mind. Go beyond that. We're not male, we're not female, in essence. Outwardly, okay, there's an apparent manifestation that we are male or female or whatever. But that's so superficial compared to what we are. So superficial compared to what we are. Other aspects that are sort of politically incorrect, are the notion of Shiva and Shakti, the notion of Maya and self. Traditionally, self is the masculine and Maya is the feminine, you see. And there is some sort of inherent sexism there, you could say. And I use that language, I will say him for God, meaning the self often, or something like that. And I'll say Maya, and I'll often feminize Maya, I'll make it into a her or a she. But please don't pay any attention to this meaning anything sexist or anything like that. It's just the language, it's just the culture, I'm afraid. When we go beyond all these words and terminologies, we come to that which we are, which is beyond all these superficialities. And I hope you can let go of these. I hope you can let go of any kind of gender-biased language, which is there sometimes, and even the way I speak of it, it can be there sometimes. I hope you can just look past that all. And it doesn't grate. I hope there's no one here thinking, it grates on me every time Tom says him for God or says her for Maya. I hope you can look past these words and know that there isn't actually any kind of underlying sexism really there. It's just the words. So sometimes I talk about the temptress, how Maya is trying to tempt you. And again, it goes into this sort of siren type figure. The sirens, the ancient Greek nymphs who used to try and tempt and lure the men who are sailing past into the rocks and then feast on their carcasses. There's a kind of, I don't know, sexist aspect to those myths. There's also it's a part of the culture and the history So we might use that language. So apologies if I do use that language and it offends anyone. I really don't want to detract from the actual teaching. Does anyone find that the language I use, or when you hear that kind of language, it really they find it off-putting in any way, or is everyone here sort of, you know what, I don't care, that I get it, it's just words, I can see past it. Does it hands up if it bothers anyone? Does it bother anyone at all? Right. Okay.
Hey, Tom, that did bother me. The Shankara. It started out, I had to read it 3 times because it just it was sort of a credibility issue when he comes right out of the gate.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Totally right. Yeah. I remember when I first came across it, and I remember this teacher trying to explain to me how it didn't really mean male body. And I just thought to myself, okay, maybe you're right. But it just felt, when I looked at all the translations myself, almost, especially the older ones, they all say male body, male body, male body. And if you look at the newer ones, let me get a newer translation. See what it says. Yeah, in this one here, it translates it as strength of body. Yeah. In this version here, this is a rendering which doesn't have verse numbers in it. It's just in text, and it's not very technically translated. So it's translated for readability. And it was translated a while ago. What's it? Swami Prabhavananda and Christopher Isherwood. And it was quite a while ago. It's not that new, but it's a sort of 1947, right? So it's not new at all, but it's newer in the scope of some of these translations. It says, "It is hard for any living creature to achieve birth in a human form. Strength of body and will are even harder to obtain. Purity is harder still. Harder even than these is the desire to live a spiritual life, and an understanding of the scriptures is hardest of all. Blah, 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 blah. Only through God's grace we obtain these things. Blah, 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 blah. Nevertheless, there are those who somehow manage to obtain this rare human birth together with bodily and mental strength and an understanding of the scriptures, yet they are so deluded they do not struggle for liberation. Such men are suicides." So what they're saying is that there's some people who have had all this luck and fortune to come across the teachings, but they still don't put them into practice. This is like committing suicide. And you can see here, they've just translated it as strength of body and will. But when you read the Sanskrit, it says male body, I think. So this is how the sort of that's how it's interpreted nowadays. I think most modern interpretation. Maybe that is the correct interpretation. I don't know, and in which case it wouldn't be sexist. But I think when I looked at it, I think it does say male body. Those who are lucky enough to have a male body. But just ignore that. I think the point of the teaching is to encourage you. When it was written, the point of it is to encourage people reading it to do the practice. That's the point. That's the point of the teaching. It's always to encourage you. If we think back to Shakespeare's time, Shakespeare was writing about 400 or 500 years ago. 400 or 500 years ago. And we think of Shakespeare as being like ancient in a way, old English. And this was written 1400 years ago, which means at Shakespeare's time, if you go back 400 years and then 400 years again, you'd have to go back 2 lots of Shakespeare, from Shakespeare, as it were, to come back to go to Shankara. This is the kind of time frame we're talking about. We're talking about before any kings and queens of England. I don't know if that means anything to you. I mean, obviously I'm in the UK. Before any of the kings and queens in England even occurred, we're talking about such a long time ago. So it's amazing that they have this kind of teaching 1400 years ago. But yeah, it's a shame it's right at the beginning. Sylvia, I'm so glad you brought it up. because I don't think I've ever spoken about that verse before. I just forget it's there. I just ignore it myself personally. Yeah, thank you. Has anyone else noticed that verse? Has it bothered anyone else? Rebecca?
I hadn't noticed that verse, but it's just funny because in Judaism there's a daily prayer, and it says thank you for not making me a woman. So it's pretty much the same. Thank you for making me a man, I think it is. And then and I had early on in my youth, I was like, why is this in here? I was asking the rabbis, what does this mean? It's exactly the same. And they would give the same kind of explanation, which is the one that makes the most sense, which is what you were saying about if you were, in those times, if you were born a woman, you didn't have the opportunity to study or to be on the path in this way. I think that's the only explanation that really sits well. But yeah, it is a sticking point because you want you want the teaching to be timeless and universal, don't you?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think that's what Fran was feeling as well. These are timeless teachings, so why on earth is there this cultural thing in there? And again, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it does mean strength of mind, strength of body. In which case, that is timeless. You have a vitality to your body that enables you to put the teachings into practice. I don't know. It doesn't feel like. It feels like to me, actually, it's probably some cultural thing come in. And if you look at one of the wonderful things about the Buddhist teachings, I mean, you do have sexism in the Buddhist teachings as well, though. But one of the things about the Buddhist teachings is that the Buddha allowed women to become ordained as monks. And again, and it doesn't matter. It didn't matter which part of society you came from. You could become ordained, in the sangha of the Buddha. He didn't care if you're a man or a woman or from a high position in society or the lowest of a low position in society. Everyone could come into his fold, and that is that time. That gives the teaching more of a timelessness. Whereas in some of the Vedic teachings, that's not always there so much, which is a real shame. But I hope we can just look past those aspects, because what we're interested in is liberation. We're not interested in becoming social commentators. So my advice is take what you can from the teachings. We don't find those sexist aspects in Raman's teachings, thankfully. We don't find that at all, at least not that I've come across. Which is one of the very beautiful things about Raman's teachings. And for me, Raman's teachings are where it's at. The fact that tradition agrees with Ramana, for me, it's that way around. Because for me, my heart connection was with Ramana. So the fact that the traditional teachings agree with him, for me, gives credence to the traditional teachings. Because I think many people feel the other way around. They'll feel like, because he agrees with tradition, you can give credence to him. But for me, Ramana is my guru. So my love is for him and his expression, his teachings. And it's wonderful that they happen to be in line with most of the traditional Vedanta style teachings. Ramana translated Viveka Chudamani as well, and I can't remember how he translated that. In fact, I'm going to look that up. Sorry, just be interested to see how he translated that. Let's have a look. This is an older version of the collected works of Ramana. So it's one of the older versions. So I wonder how it's been translated here. The newer version with sort of the grey cover, I haven't got downstairs, it's upstairs. So just grab this one. It is indeed very difficult to obtain a human body. Even though one does, it is very difficult to become a Brahmin. Even if one becomes one, it is still more difficult to walk in the path of the Dharma in which the Vedas are chanted. Yeah, so there's nothing about, he sort of says it is difficult to become a Brahmin. That's how he's translated it. So he's talking about people who are lucky enough to hear the teaching, basically. That's the way he's saying it. So that's in line with what Rebecca was saying. You know, still more difficult is it to become a perfect scholar. More difficult again to undertake inquiry into the self and not self. And then he says, if by some great penance you're lucky enough to be a human being, you're lucky enough to hear the teachings, you're lucky enough to understand the teachings, if you don't make the effort to attain liberation, you are like a fool committing suicide. And then he says, what greater fool is there than one who does not seek his own good? Meaning one who does not seek liberation. So that you can see that's the thrust of the teachings, is to encourage you to make effort and put the teaching, say, look, you're lucky enough to hear the teachings and understand the teachings. Many people hear them, but they don't understand them, but you're lucky enough to hear them and understand them. Don't commit suicide by not putting the teachings into practice. So it's really, I see it as a call to arms. You know what I mean by a call to arms? A call to action. It's meant to be, this is meant to be, I mean, if it's read in this sexist way, it becomes quite a depressing introduction to a text. But it's meant to be an inspiring introduction to inspire you to practice. And in the Buddhist tradition, we get this as well. Not about the male body thing, but they say, think about how lucky you are to be in this position. Seize this opportunity. It's one of the 4 Buddhist contemplations they have at the beginning of a lot of Buddhist teachings. And it's especially emphasized in like Tibetan Buddhism, when they emphasize, look, just reflect on how short your life is. Reflect on how many people hear these teachings. How many people are interested in these teachings? How many people come across these teachings? And how many people even understand the teachings? How many people have these opportunities? This has happened to you. Don't waste this. Another 1,000 lifetimes could go by before this opportunity occurs again for you. This is the kind of teaching it is. You know, the part of India my family are from, the main deity that's worshipped is a female deity, Durga. Durga is a woman, Ma Durga, we called her. Ma Durga means Mother Durga. She's a goddess with 10 arms, and she's more powerful than all the men, because there was this demon, and none of the male gods could defeat the demon. This is the story we were taught. Shiva, Vishnu, they couldn't defeat the demon, so they had to create a. They all the gods in the kingdom got together and created this super god, who's a goddess, Durga, and they gave Durga 10 arms, and in each of her arms she holds a weapon from each of the gods, and she was able to slay the demon that none of the other gods were able to slay. And she is the divine Shakti, the divine feminine. She's and her children are like Ganesh is in the tradition that my family brought up in, my family are from, that I was brought up in. Ganesh is her child. She's also known as Parvati in other traditions, but she's different. Durga is slightly different. Parvati is the wife of Shiva, but also known as Durga. And another incarnation of Durga is Kali. Many people have heard of Kali. This very fierce and ferocious woman, goddess. And a similar kind of story. There was another demon that none of the gods could destroy, and only Kali could destroy the god. So the teachings, you adapt the teachings to yourself.